Good morning. How is everyone? So welcome to the third lecture dealing with Aristotle's conception of friendship. And we're going to look at book 9, particularly book 9, not exclusively. And we're going to deal with three things in this lecture today. The first thing we're going to do is just a review and a general overview of Aristotle's conception of friendship, particularly as it pertains to the three forms of friendship. And then to more specifically assess, again, the two of the forms of friendship, one based on pleasure, the other based on utility, are in a sense not true or full friendship at all. Or more specifically, I think what Aristotle is hedging toward is that only complete friendship is really friendship, or genuine or true friendship, in light of what kind of people are involved in this relationship and what they do to or for or with each other. This immediately gets into ultimately a question of self-love. Is the relationship in complete friendship, is it actually a relationship not just with another person, or perhaps the question the specter has raised, is this really a relationship with ourselves that certain people carry on? So we'll do a review, and then the second thing we're going to do is address some of Aristotle's really fascinating and really interesting introductory remarks in book 9 before he gets into the depth of the questions of can people have a relationship with themselves? Can they be friends with themselves? And he gets into questions that deal with the problems of real relationships. If we think to what book 8 really consists of, is it's not a depiction of the warp and weft of actual human relations. It is a categorization of different types of relationships people have in society. And we're all subject to having these three forms of friendship to one degree or another, especially the two lower forms are an inevitable part of just our basic, connected with our basic needs of survival and getting by in civil society. So, but in book 9, we turn from types of friendships to the situations and issues actually encountered when two people try to engage in this thing, friendship, that is a certain type of reciprocal relationship based on some kind of exchange. And particularly, of course, he's determined to highlight the problems and conflicts, because if in book 8 he's concerned to illustrate this kind of perfect form of friendship called complete friendship, in book 9 he's concerned, and that is what we ought to, what we should, morally speaking, and in light of our happiness. This is what we should aspire to as human beings. Book 9 deals with the real world, what things are actually like, rather than what they should be like. And he enumerates a series of central problems that illustrate just how hard this highest form of friendship is really to attain. And these problems, what's really exciting about book 9 is the problems that we encounter that he enumerates are things that we can all really relate to and understand. And I encourage you all to, when we look at these problems, to really think in terms of your own relationships and how these problems are very much indicative of things you're familiar with. Then we'll turn to the theme of self-love. And the question is, can one have a friendship with oneself? And that seems to deal with the question of self-love, because having self-love seems to be like or the same as friendship with oneself. And so what we're going to encounter is that Aristotle's going to have two definitions of self-love in the same way that he's had multiple definitions of types of friendship. He's going to have two types of self-love, one good and one bad. The bad one is going to turn out, just like friendship, the lower forms of friendship, it's going to turn out not to really be self-love at all. In fact, it's going to just appear as self-love. And in fact, it's going to be a form, actually even a form of kind of self-hatred or disdain for oneself, connected with feelings of shame and guilt. And then the good form of self-love is going to appear to be a kind of ideal relationship with oneself. Okay, So let's begin our review. So we've looked at these three forms of friendship. Remember, friendship is not a feeling. It's not a desire towards someone. Friendship, as Aristotle understands it, the Greek word is philia. It can be translated as love, but maybe the best word it is a love relationship. It's not a feeling, but it is a certain arrangement and coexistence between two or more human beings. And therefore, in that arrangement, two things are absolutely central: exchange and reciprocity of exchange. If you don't have exchange, you don't have a relationship. If exchange is not reciprocal, and you come to discover that in the course of being in a friendship or relationship, the relationship was never really there and it dissolved. This is going to be important in Book 9, it just appeared to be there. So then the three forms of friendship are predicated or based on the three different types of things that human beings can exchange. And Aristotle sees this as a kind of comprehensive and universal categories of everything that might be exchanged. And he says the three forms are based on the exchange of the three things that are lovable, which are the useful, the pleasant, and the good. Useful is in that it is necessary or central to our basic needs of getting by, or starting the most fundamental need of survival. Pleasant, that it gives us feelings of pleasure, whether of body or of soul. And he's mentioned two types of pleasures. One of the soul, he talks about people who are witty and you're around them and you enjoy their company because they're kind of like the class clown, but that's not synonymous with actually liking them for who they are. You like what they do, not what they are, and he makes a kind of subtle distinction between them. You can enjoy the class clown, but you cannot appreciate their character and be connected with them. And then the good. And the good here is an interesting ambiguous meaning, because in a general sense, the useful and the pleasant are goods that could be or appear to be beneficial to you. The word good here, friendship of the good, that which is good, it seems to, on the one hand, have a clear moral component, that which is morally good, that it is right and appropriate, and is involves the right conduct, the right actions. It also, obviously, it's friendship of the good, meaning people of good character. But how does Aristotle understand what a good human being is, what a good action is, or what having good character as a human being means? It's connected with moral and intellectual virtue, right? So good could be in the context of moral virtue, or good could be in the context of intellectual virtue, in which it has an ambiguous moral content to it. Remember, virtue means human excellence. So here the word good seems to be connected with human excellence in general. Moral excellence turns out to be one facet of our excellence as human beings, but it's not the totality. And I've already mentioned the great ambiguities of this text as to whether to be an excellent human being and therefore happy. Remember, happiness is activity in accord with virtue. And if there are many virtues, the best and most complete one, notice, singular, right? And the great debate, and the answer is in Book 10, and I leave it all to you. We'll touch on Book 10 a little bit toward the end. Can one be intellectually virtuous and happy if they lack moral virtue? Now, in the literature, which is to say 2,500 years of thinking about this question that Aristotle poses, there have been two decisive camps in answering this question, and they both think they are right. And the one says, well, to be intellectually virtuous, it would naturally follow that you would also be morally virtuous. And that necessarily the two go together. And in fact, to get by in society, you have to exhibit a certain amount of moral virtue just to get by in the rat race. Others say, no, no, no. If you are so bright, you could be a wicked genius who disregards moral virtue and is intellectually superior and has a way of getting around the problems that would come from being not good, right? If you think of Gyges, let's say his ring is not simply one of invisibility. Let's say his ring is one of genius to outwit the authorities and outwit the people who want him, strung up in the town square at every turn. And that he uses intelligence to cloak himself in maybe the appearance of virtue when he is not. And he gets away with it all, and he does everything he wants, and he's a superior human being because he exhibits intellectual virtue. But he's also a diabolical evil genius. The question is that person happy? Now, some people have answered, yes! So, which is only to say you're going to reach your own conclusions on that. But it paints two very different images of Aristotle, depending on what side you come. And of course, Aristotle does not telegraph the answer here. That's what's really fascinating about all this. But let's be clear. For Aristotle, in Book 10, it is very clear that the life of happiness consists in the exercise of intellectual virtue. That is, using one's powers of reasoning to understand the world around them, right? And he says, and this might be contrary to our own impulse as American Democrats, little d, or Christians, or people of faith, moral virtue in Aristotle is demoted to a subordinate status. And the reason for that has to do with what makes for a distinctly human life. He's actually going to argue in a fairly subtle way, it's certainly not obvious, that moral virtue has more to do with the practical realm. Aristotle sees moral virtue as connected with the necessities of the real world. I mean, if you think about what moral virtue does, it means in society, it means doing the right thing. But doing the right thing per society's demands and expectations. Remember, on one hand, it is society burdening you with all these rules, and it all depends on how you understand the rules, whether the rules are simply beneficial to society at large, or whether they're actually beneficial for you to follow them for their own sake. So therefore, for Aristotle, morality, and this is not unusual compared to thinkers on ethical questions, he sees morality as the realm of practical, whereas intellectual virtue is the highest use of one's reason. And if reason is the thing that distinguishes us from animals, then what gives us or makes for a most fully human life is one where we're using our reason to its fullest extent, to its fullest capacity. And for him, that's intellectual virtue. And there is one virtue in Book 10 that he highlights as the virtue that is virtually synonymous with happiness. Okay, so let's just wrap up here with this review. We'll go out of order here a little bit, but just to highlight the goods exchanged, and then based on the nature of the exchange, which is to say the thing exchanged, it's going to result in stability and instability, a short or a long duration, the person being treated as a means or an end, and therefore the relationship being complete or incomplete. Let's be very clear. A complete relationship has to do with engaging all of you as a human being. Therefore, the person has to like you for you. So that's in one way it's complete. It's also complete in its duration. And then it's also complete in the sense that the relationship completes you. What does completion mean for Aristotle? It means the fulfillment of our nature, right? We talked about our human nature with its raw capacities being cultivated, and then things like reason and virtue being fully developed to attain happiness. So therefore, obviously, complete friendship has to deal with the collective engagement in reason and virtue, moral and intellectual virtue. And therefore, we're going to be most alike, because complete friends doing good deeds for one another, they're going to be more similar than they are different. And therefore, they're going to be also more equal. And those are the very things, performing virtuous deeds, being more alike and being equal, that are going to perpetuate this relationship. Because every time you do something for the other person, you're also benefiting yourself intrinsically, because performing a virtuous deed with or to another person is Aristotle's very definition of happiness, right? So therefore, the other two relationships, you're only interested in the other person as a means rather than an end. And therefore they're transient, because you're only tangentially attached to that person by way of the good that's being exchanged, because the good isn't them. In complete friendship, in a sense, the good is the other person. For Aristotle, for the Greeks, you are what you do. What's the expression? Stupid is as stupid does. So the person of virtuous deeds is also a good person. There is no, in Aristotle, I say I'm a great person, but then I don't live up to what I say. There is a simple harmony between action and the being of the person. They're one and the same. You are what you do, just like you are what you eat. So if we look very quickly at the nature of this exchange, let's just recap. The key thing here is that in the first two forms, you see that exchange is done under the intention of what you're going to get in return. What you're going to get in return. And your intention is also, second part of the intention, I am not directly concerned with the other person for their own sake. I am not treating them as an end in themselves. I am not giving them something for them. In fact, I'm giving them something for me. And it's a very simple equation. When I go to Starbucks and I give my $5 for my half-caf decaf latte with the macchiato caramel and my name on it, I am giving that money because I'm expecting something in return, right? So this is really almost a kind of economic exchange here, in which the friendship, such as it is really just based on a general level of trust and a contractual relationship, that I'm giving you this and you're obliged to give this to me back. In complete friendship, which exhibits the second form of exchange, we see that the intention behind it is twofold, and the two aspects are connected. I'm giving something as a gift, meaning I am not explicitly doing it with the premeditated intention of getting something in return for it. Number one. Therefore, the gift signifies I give without any expectation of return. And the second part of the intention is that I am giving to them precisely to benefit them. Is this a model of pure altruism? A model of pure selflessness? I think the answer is clearly no. And I don't see anywhere in Aristotle of the notion of the type of self-sacrifice where there is nothing gained as a result of the sacrifice. When someone engages in the act of liberality, which is just a word for generosity or magnanimity, this is a moral virtue. They give money or wealth, property to another person because they have the amount to give it. Now, they give up a certain amount of wealth, but they gain in an act of moral virtue, which contributes to their happiness, number one. And number two, it also is going to gain them notoriety, honors, and recognition from other people. They're going to be rewarded for the act in being highly or more highly esteemed. So this is not a zero-sum game when they give up this gift. What are they doing when they give this gift? They're performing a virtuous deed, and a virtuous deed is a very definition of happiness. What is Aristotle's ultimate concern? It's stated very clearly by Kant, and Kant talks about rational beings. He's talking about human beings. I'm not going to read everything here. I'm going to read the middle passage. Aristotle says, as rational beings, we have intrinsic worth and dignity, and therefore that worth and dignity and that freedom needs to be acknowledged in our relationships. We have to be loved and respected, deeds have to be done, and we have to be treated as ends in ourselves. To treat a human being as a means is to treat them as a tool, and to treat them as a tool is something more like a slave than a fully human being. We have to recognize our humanity. What is the meaning of recognizing another's humanity? It is to recognize that they are an end in themselves, not just a means to gain what you want. And therefore it is in complete friendship in which we're recognizing not just the other person's status as an end, but also our own. Think about this for a second. Every time we are in a situation of those two lower forms, we're not just using other people, but we're being used ourselves, right? And this is a classic word we use. We use the person, and, hey man, that person's a tool. Like, I was just nice to them because I wanted the answers for the test, right? So, if you're using other people, you also seem to be implicitly acknowledging that you're there just to be used. So if you want to be treated as an end yourself, it seems obligatory that you also attempt to treat others. So what's Kant's big statement? He says, for human beings, or rational beings, all stand under the law that every one of them, this is, he believes, a law of human conduct, that every one of them ought to treat themselves and others never merely as a means, but also at the same time as ends in themselves. Now notice he says never merely as a means. The problem is we all have to treat each other as, to put it crudely, tools. We all have to use one another because we all need stuff. And what we need is not always the other person. We need what they're offering, which is a distinction that is central to understanding the difference between complete friendship and the other two forms. Now we have to treat others as means because we have needs, right? But he says the goal is to also treat them as ends in themselves, and this is the great challenge of friendship. So we'll raise some central quotations here that start to insinuate Aristotle's concern for self-love. He says in Book 8 that a friend is another self or another himself, right? He talks about in Book 9 how friends grow together and experience the same pleasures and pains, have similar characters, go through the same life experiences. Well, then the question becomes, who do you have the most commonality in terms of pleasures and pains and experience? Well, that is yourself. So on one hand, a friend is another himself, and on another hand, yourself is a friend, because that is the being you're most familiar with. And you could say the whole conception of human self-love is predicated on the notion that because we have a rational soul, it's actually very simple. We can think about things. And one thing we can think about is our own life and our own existence and our own self. And that we're able to then reflect on our own life. And therefore, by doing so, have an ongoing psychological relationship with ourselves because of that cognitive and linguistic reflection that is the ongoing kind of narrative that we're spinning in our heads of our lives. Aristotle's quoted by Diogenes Laertius. He's a late Greek historian of the philosophers of ancient Greece, and he says, friends are two bodies with one soul. Two bodies with one soul. Well, what is one person? They're one body with one soul. They are synonymous with themselves. So they have a perfect identity. What's the whole notion here? Friends are people who have identity of soul. And the Greek word for this is homonoia, like-mindedness, or having a common soul. And then Montaigne says, riffing, not quoting, but riffing off of Aristotle, my friends, there is no friend. My friends, there is no friend. What does he mean? Well, what he might mean is that complete friendship can only be possible with a kind of perfect harmony of souls. And the problem is what? There is no perfect harmony of souls to be had with distinct other human beings. You can only have a perfect harmony with yourself. But what are we going to see when we look at self-love? There's even problems with being in harmony with yourself, right? So there's going to be a kind of schism or a conflict with a dividedness within, not just between people, but within people, that's going to prevent them from having perfect relationships with themselves. And this is going to start to spell out the negative form of self-love, or the bad form of self-love that turns out not to be self-love at all. Okay. So we've talked about these two things. The more we're like-minded, the more our souls are the same, and therefore the more equally are, more identical. And so in Book 8, he raises this question. He says, as to whether or not there is friendship in relationship to oneself, let us set this question aside for the present, though it would seem that there is friendship in this sort of way, insofar as each person is two or more on the basis of the points stated, and that the peak of friendship is like friendship towards oneself. Now let's step through this statement for a second. Why is friendship between oneself possible? He says because each person is two, well, there's no comma, two or more. Now, we have multiple personalities. What is he talking about? We have a conversation in our head. What is he talking about? I think when he says two or more, I think he's simply referring to the division in our soul between either reason and passion, or the separation between reason and the two passions, thumos and epithumia, right? We have conflicting centers of motivation, right? Conflicting centers of motivation. We've seen the puppet that's pulled by different strings in different directions, right? That sounds like a conflict. The different parts of us are actually in opposition to them. And the question is, what is our true self? In the sense of, when we sit there or when we act, what is the part of which part of our soul do we truly identify with? Or which combination of the parts? It's never absolutely one thing. And of course, one of the problems is this fluctuates over time. In one moment, we're identifying with one part, and in another, we're identifying with another. And an integrated person would be one who identifies with the same part consistently in an ongoing way. And therefore, since we have this division within us, we're able to have a relationship with those divisions toward one another, either positive in harmony or negative in conflict or disharmony. So there's going to be an issue of harmony and disharmony of the soul here. Right? But then he goes on to say the peak of friendship is like friendship toward oneself. Right? And he could be asking two things here when he says, can there be friendship toward oneself? He could be asking, on the one hand, does this category of relationship exist at all? And I think the simple answer is yes. It absolutely exists, and actually seems to start to become, by Book 9, the central of his focus of discussion, which is very odd because in the politics and the ethics, we are dominated by a picture of human nature as a distinctly social and political animal whose very identity is bound to their connections between their family, friends, and other citizens. And now in Book 9, we have a tremendously isolated or autonomous or individualistic view of the defining feature of human nature, that the highest form of friendship might turn out to actually be friendship with oneself. And then I think, so is he asking the question of whether this category exists, or is he asking whether it's really fully possible? Because the only way it's fully possible is if we're perfect beings with no flaws. Complete friendship, you could say it becomes more complete the better you are. But since nobody's perfect, nobody attains this highest state of perfection. I mean, Aristotle defines a perfect being as a god, a being that lacks nothing. Right? Okay. On the beginning of Book 9, Aristotle raises some really juicy questions dealing with real-world problems of friendships. And these are just central structural problems that we see in all relationships. And he identifies them roughly as follows, and roughly in this order, but not precisely. Number one, the problem of unequal exchange of goods. Okay. When there is an unequal exchange of goods, number one, and number two, either party perceives or recognizes that unequal exchange is not going to continue, and the relationship is going to break down. But that, of course, is connected with the second problem, the problem of appearance from reality. He continues to talk about the issue of deception and self-deception. In both cases of deception, we see an appearance that is not consistent with the reality of the thing, right? If we believe we've engaged in a relationship that is complete friendship, but in fact we're just getting used, we're not really in the friendship we thought we were in. So the appearance and reality has to do with the appearance of the other person's intentions. It has to do with the appearance of what we think we're getting in terms of the good of exchange. And it turns out that the reality may be something different. And how are we going to know that the reality is something different? Well, it's going to take time and judgment. One of the problems Aristotle is going to point out is that we all have an intense desire for human intimacy, human solidarity, comradeship, connectedness, emotional connectedness, and we're going to be willing to be deceived by others, self-deception, because of our desire for that connection with other human beings. On the other hand, people are going to be inclined to deceive us for the sake of getting what they want, because they might not otherwise get it if they were forthright about what their true intentions were. These problems are really interesting, and they're going to play out again in the symposium when we look at Pausanias' speech on the relationship between the lover and the beloved, and what seems to be offered in that relationship versus the reality of it. So we're all familiar with these kind of issues. Then the next one is the problem of changes. And there's a whole variety of changes that we go through. But the one thing clear in Book 9 when he talks about these things is that he talks about it from the point of view of the introduction of time, right? Number one, our characters undergo changes. We become different people as we get older. We go through more experiences. Not only do we just have experience, plain and simple, but we have then different types of experience that some people have had and some people have not had. And that gives us, this is going to be interesting for Aristotle, very interesting analysis, or I should say perspicacious. He understands how experiences shape our relationship with pleasure and pain. You might even call it a kind of taste, a moral taste, such that having had certain experiences, it's going to naturally make certain things pleasurable to us and certain things painful. Now, whether we're talking about emotionally, physically, or just morally. So certain things that we call good, are also going to be associated with being pleasurable. Things that are bad are ultimately going to be displeasurable, which is why we make them bad in the first place. We're going to discover that in a whole variety of instances, the one thing that inspires or stimulates pleasure in one person stimulates pain in another. Now, if that's the case, there is virtually no way those people can persist in relationships, particularly when they're living tooth and jowl and they're sharing meals and sharing a bedroom, right? You think of the manger sharers and the meal sharers, mentioned by Charondas in the Politics, right? And then he's already introduced it in Book 8, but the discussion of the stages of life. He says there's youthful people who are driven by their passions, they're fickle, they're capricious, because they're driven by their passions and they're just getting their feet in the real world and experiencing these passions, they change with their passions. And at any stage in life, passions are constantly being generated. They're fickle, they're blind, they want what they want, but they don't foresee the consequences of them. And the young, he just makes a general statement. He says most young are driven by their passions and impulses. And he talks about erotic desire. One day they like this person, and the next day this person looks good, and so on and so forth. But it could be, of course, any passion. And connected with this is just the different demands of different stages of life. He has a kind of middle stage, which is the kind of prime of life, in which we found our feet, we're using our reason, our minds, our souls are at its sharpest. And then it talks about old age, when you actually become more dependent on other people. And of course, that's frustrating because you've spent an adult life being more independent and you're more like a child in some sense, and you have a great need for the necessities of life. And he talks about old people being grumpy and things like that, but also connected with certain degrees of deterioration of one's thinking ability. Then there's problems of good and bad character. Can bad people be friends? His answer pretty clearly is no. But then he asks in book 9 more nuanced questions like, what if we're not equal in character? What if one person is here and the other person is here? What is our obligation to stay in a relationship with a person who doesn't have the same character? Well, this raises the obvious question that there is no relationship where people have perfectly commensurate or equal characters. So we're always dealing with that question of how to negotiate that. And of course, it's true of all of these questions. These are functions of all relationships. And all of these problems tend toward the dissolution of the relationship. And yet, given that these problems are always in every real relationship, it means we're constantly having to navigate problems that actually threaten the very existence of our relationship. So this gets into number 6, the problem of whether to persist or dissolve a relationship if one of these problems exists. And I pretty much said it, that these problems to one degree or another always exist in real relationships. And it starts to appear by book 9 that complete friendship, like happiness, is a kind of a target to be aspired toward, but it's almost a kind of state of perfection that it is beyond the grasp of an ordinary mortal, but rather simply a target to be kind of aimed for. If we aim that high, we will do pretty well, even if we can't hit the target itself. Where do all these problems emerge from? In Book 8, Chapter 4, I think this is the central problem for friendship for Aristotle. He says, those who swiftly make proofs of friendship to each other wish to be friends, but are not such unless they are also lovable and know this about each other. Right? So look at the two conditions here. What do we all do? We all want to make swift proofs, demonstrations of our connectedness with other people. Why? The second sentence. For a wish for friendship arises swiftly, but friendship, or true friendship itself, does not. So notice the distinction he's making here between just being in a relationship and that relationship actually being a friendship. It's not the same thing. The problem is what? It takes time to discover what the relationship actually is compared to what it appears to be, or compared to what you think it is, because what you think it is at the beginning is not necessarily what it turns out to be. In Book 9, there's almost like a concept of bait and switch in issues of deception and self-deception. It appears that I'm getting this from the person, but whoa, now that I've spent time in it, I'm not actually getting anything out of that thing out of it, but I still have this connection with the person. Should I let go, or should I leave because I've been deceived? That's a classic question of, romantic relationships. You get deceived, but you go, oh, I have someone. I have them. I can't let them go because we've been together for 2 years or however long it is. But I'm not really getting what I want. What am I doing? But, oh, I can't be alone. And, so the tensions. But, being alone, you're not getting what you want anyway with them. So in some ways it may be worse. He says, what really makes for a friendship is that the person is lovable. And the highest form of the thing that's lovable is the good, right? So a friendship has to be based on the good. But then you have to know this about the other person. And this is why you see that knowing someone for Aristotle is loving them, and loving someone is knowing them. Because to love someone, you have to know what you are loving, and you cannot know what you are loving until you get to know them. And the great challenge is, once you know them, you may actually find out that they're not who you thought they were. Why? Because you wish them to be your image of them. So this also gets into problems of self-love, where we project an image on the other person, particularly at the outset of the relationship, when we really don't know much about them. And then here's this beatific image, oh, my true love. And then you get to know them, and then, either those things converge and you're going to be happy, or you discover, well, wait a second, my image here is not like this. But then, of course, there's issues of like, do you recognize that they're not the same? Because we desire that relationship, maybe we're going to deceive ourselves about the distinction between what we thought it was and what it really is. So, Book 9, Chapter 1, the first few words, he says, in all heterogeneous friendships. That's all we need from that first sentence. In all heterogeneous relationships. Well, what's heterogeneous? Where the two people are different. Rather than homogeneous, they're the same. Now, they're heterogeneous maybe in terms of their characters, maybe in terms of their status, maybe in terms of what they contribute, maybe in terms of the specific nature of the object of exchange, right? And of course, the more heterogeneous, the more distinct they are, the more we're going to struggle to have a relationship. But what is Aristotle acknowledging here? All relationships are by definition heterogeneous because they're not you. They're not you. So then the most homogeneous, the most harmonious relationship one could have would be with oneself. But then there's a qualification with why. So he turns to the issues of heterogeneous relationships. He says, but there's also perplexity concerning whether or not to dissolve friendships with those who do not remain the same as they were. Some people are friends with a view to what is either useful or what is pleasant. It is not strange to dissolve the friendship is it not strange to dissolve the friendship when these no longer exist? So he's talking about, do you maintain a relationship when people change? And what he's talking about is changing in terms of either who they are or their what they're offering in terms of their object of exchange. And why are they going to change? I mean, they may change because they have become different people through time. They may change because they actually never changed, but you are now aware that they're not who that you thought they were, either because you deceived yourself or they deceived you. And then what do we do about it? Do we leave the relationship or do we try to work it out? The great question. For they used to be friends of these things. When they lose them, it is with good reason that we no longer love each other. But someone could level an accusation if another who was fond of him on account of utility or pleasure was pretending to be fond of him on account of his character. So you could level an accusation of guilt that someone who actually loved you out of utility or pleasure was pretending to love you for your character. That invokes the three types of friendship right there. Complete friendship is loving the other person because of their character. What is this person doing? I am pretending to be in a complete friendship with you, when in fact I am just exploiting you for your utility and the pleasure I get from you. So what are they doing there? They're purposely misrepresenting the relationship so they can get what they want, and what you're getting is not what you think you're getting. For as we have said in the beginning, most differences arise among friends when the sort of friend they suppose themselves to be is not the same as the sort of friends they actually are. He says most differences, the problem, arises among friends when the sort of friends they thought they were not the same as they actually were. And why is that? Because the wish for friendship arises quickly and the reality of it does not. It takes time. And we wish for something, we project an image on the other person, and it is only through time where we determine what the relationship is between that image and reality. Right? A first impression is still just an impression. When someone is deceived then and assumes that he is loved on account of his character, or even though the other person does no such thing, he should blame himself. See, this is self-deception, in which we wish to be loved for our character, because that's our highest form of self-worth, right? We don't want to be loved for the money we have or that we buy things for someone. We want to be loved as an end in ourselves. To say we're loved for our character is to say we're treated as an end in ourselves. And who doesn't want that? But of course, we can be easily deceived because of that aspiration. But when he is deceived by the other who is pretending, so someone is purposely putting on a pretext, it is just to accuse the deceiver, and more so than to accuse those who are counterfeiting currency insofar as the wrongdoing concerns a more honorable thing. Right? So he says someone who deceives you about the nature of the friendship is counterfeiting currency. Relationship is an exchange based on the exchange of, you could say, a certain type of currency, love, right? And counterfeit is fake money, and in a relationship, it's fake love. I'm pretending to love you when let's put it in our words. Someone's pretending to love you so they can get something, so they can use you, right? And since you're susceptible to wanting to be loved, you're going to naturally be subject to being deceived. But if someone accepts another person as good, in good character, and that other becomes corrupt, or seems so, must he still love him? Or is it not possible, if indeed not everything is lovable, but only the good? So what do? Someone appears of good character, and they become, or maybe they are, and they become corrupted. Do you walk away? Should you walk away? Right? Interesting question. For what is base is neither lovable nor ought to be loved. What is base is the antithesis of good character, or the antithesis of noble or morally virtuous. It's the opposite. Since one must not be a lover of what is base, or make oneself like a base person, because that's inconsistent with our human nature. And it has been said that like friend is to like. Must one then immediately dissolve this relationship? Or should one not do this in every case, but only in the case of those whose corruption is incurable? So his answer is pretty clear there. If you think their corruption, quote unquote, is incurable, like they're never going to change, they have some kind of serious character flaw, what's the answer? His answer is going to be, bye-bye. But, he says, if this person just has a deficiency of character that can be remedied, right? And think about what complete friendship aspires to. Good deeds done to each other, in part to make each other better human beings. Aristotle's then going to argue, if this person you think can be cured, quote unquote, you actually have an obligation to maintain the commitment, so long as they actually demonstrate that they can become a better human being. And as for those who can be set aright, one must come to their aid, more as regards their character than their property, right? So some people are dealing with issues of utility, but the thing we're really concerned with is complete friendship, issues of character and virtue, insofar as doing the former is better and belongs more to friendship. He says, but he who dissolves the friendship in such circumstances would not be held to be doing anything strange, for he was not originally a friend to the person of that sort. So what's he saying? Really he's saying this person appeared to have good character. This person did not have good character. If you leave the relationship, you're actually not dissolving anything because it wasn't there. The real friendship was never there to begin with. Think of the money. Were those people ever really friends? No, they were people he called friends. And that's why the money is such a great object lesson that plays into the ethics, because it highlights the language that is used, and that there's a disconnect between the language used to talk about those relationships, those people, and the actual reality of them, the distinction between appearance and reality. So what's really happening here? You're not dissolving the relationship when you dissolve it. You're just recognizing the lack of relationship to begin with. That is a tricky thought there. But if one person, let's go to the second page here. Second paragraph here. But if one person in the friendship should remain the same when the other becomes more decent, and in fact greatly surpasses him in virtue, ought the latter to treat the former as a friend, or is this impossible? And where the difference is great, the impossibility becomes especially clear. For example, in childhood friendships. Perfect example, that's straight out of the money. It's easy to be friends as kids because you're around each other and that's who you have to play with. But then you're going to grow and develop. You're going to undergo different experiences. You're going to grow at different rates and to different degrees. And it's only natural that you, in many cases, that you're no longer friends with those people because you really weren't you as a child. You hadn't grown in to develop and realize all the various facets of your own character. For if the one person remains a child in his understanding, whereas the other should be a most excellent man in this very respect, how could they be friends if they were if neither are pleased by the same things, nor delight in and are pained by the same things? So two really important here. You know, the woman on Oprah. I have grown so much, and he is still just a man-child. Oh no, I'm leaving him, right? So one person has grown and the other person remains the same. But what's the problem? What's the real problem? It has to do with likenesses in shared pleasures and pains. Ultimately, for Aristotle, on the most basic level, friendships are a structure of relationship based on a structure. It's a relationship based on a structure of similar pleasures and pains. What do we talk about? We're talking similar pleasures and pains. We're not talking about physical pleasures and pains. We're talking about the pleasures and pains psychologically and morally that have been habituated into us. What is each community? A group of people bound by a same set of laws or rules that force them to act in the same ways and understand the same things as both good and bad and pleasurable and painful. The things that are good are also pleasurable. The things that are bad are also painful, not in a simple physical, sometimes they are in a simple physical sense. Like murder is bad and it's also physically going to be painful, or harming someone physically is bad and it's also physically painful. But many of these pains are going to be psychological and moral pains of one kind. Shame is a moral pain, right? So this ultimately has to do with having a common morality with the other person. You said, you don't have a common morality with another person. You're not going to have a relationship with them. It's just not going to happen. But what does common morality really represent? A common, you could say, taste of pleasures and pains. So that's the big claim. But how does that form? Through habit and experience. Over time, we get cultivated, we get habituated to be adjusted to certain things being pleasurable and certain things being painful. If you get up every morning and run 5 miles, in a year, that's enjoyable. For the other person who hasn't been doing that, that's bloody murder, right? And if you have those things in common, you're going to be in sync with one another in the same way you're in sync with yourself, right? And who do you have the most pleasures and pains in common with? Yourself. And what's the problem? Because you're the only person who's had the particular experiences you've had that have shaped your pleasures and pains morally and psychologically. So now in a moment we will come to chapter 4 of book 9 that introduces the theme of self-love. And what is self-love? We love ourselves the most because we have needs, and it's our body that's having the needs, and we're the being simultaneously. That same body, that same self needs to satisfy them. Therefore, we simply need to be most concerned with ourselves rather than other people. We can't even help other people until we have taken care of ourselves first. That principle of, like, when you're on the airplane, you put your mask on first before your child's. Not because you love yourself more, but because you're forced to take care of yourself first if you want to help them. Then secondly, slightly distinct from the needs is self-love implies we love what is most like us. And we love what is most like us, I think, because we know it best and we're most familiar with it, and what is most like us but ourselves. And then those people radiating out from us that are like us, but then as you go further out, people become less and less and less like us. Why are our family members so close to us in terms of our sense of self-love? Because we're genetically similar. We look the same. And then we've spent all this time as manger sharers and meal sharers in our households together, and we've developed the same affectations. We have the same common experiences we're familiar with, and that forms a whole set of common pleasures and pains that bind us together as if they are like another us, right? And we can see in them we really can see in them something that's very similar to us. Okay, And I just have two statements by Alexander Hamilton really capturing the social consequence of self-love. And he puts this very eloquently. He says, Alexander Hamilton, one of the great founders of our country, and trying to understand how to found the government, they had to understand what human nature was really like, and they turned to the concept of self-love as being the kind of almost a ground zero of social reality. We have to acknowledge that self-love is one of the most powerful motivating forces and forces of attachment. He says there are certain social principles in human nature from which we may draw the most solid conclusions with respect to the conduct of individuals and of communities. He says we love our families more than our neighbors, right? Now the only thing he left out is we love ourselves first, most of all, but family, to love yourself is also to love your family when you realize how you're interconnected with the rest of your family and your own fate is tethered to theirs. You can love other people as you would love yourself. We love our families more than our neighbors because our neighbors are just the people next to us. They don't spend their lives with us. They're not genetically the same. Then we love our neighbors more than our countrymen in general. So notice these expanding circles of similarity, and you start with yourself and you move out to your whole nation and you get less proximate and also because of that less similar. And therefore there's less affection or affinity or connection. It says the human affections, like the solar heat, loses their intensity as they depart from the center. Well, what is the center? The center is you, and then your family, and then your neighborhood, and then your state, and then your country. And then think, at least in your own country, you can speak the same language and you know the same popular culture and the same kind of political ethos. Then you go to another country and it's totally foreign, right? Things get more foreign as you go out from the center, from the sun, which is you. As they depart from the center and become languid, they become weak in proportion to the expansion of the circle. So the more our affections radiate outward, the weaker they get. That's a pretty clear, simple observation. He says something very similar in the Federalist Papers. He says, the strong propensity of the human heart, it is a known fact in human nature that its affections are commonly weak in proportion to the distance or diffusiveness of the object. So the further away the human being is from you and yourself, the less bond, the less emotional bond or affection there is. Upon the same principle that a man is more attached to his family than to his neighborhood than to the community at large, the people of each state would be apt to feel a stronger bias toward their local governments than toward the government. Okay, so he gets into the political implications of this statement. But you see what we're talking about here. Okay, self-love. A great example comes in Aristotle's Politics. The female and male couple for the sake of procreation. They do not do so from deliberate choice, but like other animals and plants, because the urge to leave behind something of the same kind as themselves is natural. Notice the motivation for procreation, which is the Darwinian survival of the species. The motivation is in a sense connected with your own survival because it's like you, but the motivation is self-love. The desire to leave something behind of the same kind. To leave behind a part of yourself and for it to persist. And so it gets at issues of self-love and also the desire for immortality, right? But Aristotle identifies the fundamental process of procreation and the production of the family as a result of self-love. In Book 8, Chapter 8, Aristotle raises some of these same questions, and I'm not going to read all this, but he talks about parents' love for their children, and they love them because they're, well, let's just read this part. It says, parents then love children as they love themselves, self-love, for those who come from them are like other selves separately existing. Whereas children love their parents on the grounds that they are born from them. Notice it doesn't sound quite as strong. And brothers love each other because they were born from the same parents. Their sameness, self-love, in relationship to these parents constitutes the sameness brothers share with each other, which is why people claim to be the same blood, the same root, and such things. They are in some way the same thing, but also in some ways not. Therefore, even though the same thing resides in the separate persons. So now in Book 8, Chapter 8, which we'll look at in just a second, we'll get into Aristotle's wading into the theme of self-love. And I think the simplest way to do this is just establish what we're talking about at the outset and then identifying it in the text, because it's not always so straightforward. But there are two forms of self-love, and they both have an appearance and reality. Let's start with the bad form of self-love, because that's where he starts out. And actually, we'll hold off on the details of the good self-love. Bad form of self-love is someone who, for whatever reason, seeks out the attention of others. Bad form of self-love is more like egoism. And you would say very simply, this isn't really genuinely, truly loving yourself in a kind of wholesome, righteous, decent, virtuous way. In fact, it may turn out that these people do not feel good about themselves, and that this is precisely why they seek the attention, the flattery, the recognition of other people. So the people who exhibit the bad form of self-love, they appear in society as the most popular people. They appear narcissistic, they seek out the attentions of other people, they're popular, right? And they have this incredible desire for honor and recognition. And here's the key thing about this form of self-love. It simply means that they want to be loved by other people. Now, if we go back to the three lives, in Book 1, Chapter 5, Aristotle has said that the life of politics is the life of honor and recognition. But the problem with this life is that these people want to convince themselves that they are good. If you need to be convinced that you are good by the affections of other people, it insinuates that you may not be so good. That's the first part. Then he says, but friendship is something, or excuse me, he's talking about happiness. He says, this doesn't seem to be happiness, because happiness is something that is durable and under one's own control, right? And the problem with happiness or friendship based on desiring the love of other people is that there's no guarantee that it's going to continue and that it can be cut off at any time. It's not something you're fully in control over. And when you think of things like popularity, these kind of things fluctuate all the time. They're based on people's passions. And these people desire to be flattered. They want to be told. They appear good to the other person. This is the key thing. They appear good, but they are not, because they are putting on a pretense, and the other people don't really know them fully. And what they have is not really friends, but flatterers. And what do flatterers do? I mean, a flatterer is not a friend, because a friend tells you the truth when it's to your benefit. And a flatterer, what they do is they lie to you, to put it in the most extreme terms. They tell you that you're the greatest thing since sliced bread. Why? Because they want something from you. And the flatterer, no less than the egotist, is engaged in forms of deception, right? He's also said this, that it is superior to love rather than to be loved. It is a higher thing to love rather than be loved. One, because love is active, and loving someone, in effect, is performing a virtuous deed toward them, and it is synonymous with the definition of happiness. Think complete friendship is performing acts of love or virtue toward the other person. That's beneficial to you, and it also means you've done something actively. You don't passively receive it. Also, just your actions are under your own control. You're not dependent on what the other person does. But the people with the bad form of self-love, for lack of a better term, are desiring attentions from others. And we'll come back to why this is later on. Let's just say the good person loves others and has a good soul, and they actually are only going to have a small number of friends, because how many complete friends can anybody have? I mean, this seems to be almost an unattainable relationship. So the good person with good self-love is actually going to appear with not many friends. They're not going to appear actually particularly social, because they're not out vying for the flattery, the honor, the recognition of as many people as possible. They only want the recognition of those people whose judgment they actually respect, because it's wise, because it comes from a place of good character, and so on. So good self-love is true self-love. Bad self-love is actually going to turn out to be self-hatred. So in Book 8, Aristotle says this: but the many seem, on account of their love of honor. What is love of honor? It's desire for recognition, attention, flattery from other people. On account of their love or honor, to be wished to be loved more than to love. Hence the many lovers of flattery. Hence the many are lovers of flattery. The flatterer is a friend who is inferior, or at any rate he pretends to be inferior, and to love more than he is loved. Right? So you see, the flatterer is the deceiver, and they're misrepresenting the very nature of the exchange of the relationship. They are not a friend at all. They are just presenting themselves with the airs and gestures of friendship. He says, but those who long for honor from people who are decent and who know them aim at confirming their own opinion of themselves. So that seems appropriate. But those who long for honor from people who are decent, we might just say people with wisdom and good judgment, people of good character, decent, and who know them aim at confirming their own opinion of themselves. Right? So the only way you can have a good person value you highly is for you to be a good person as well. Right? I think for Aristotle, if you're a good person, you already know this, and it's confirmed in your relationships with others already. They delight in honor, and therefore, since they trust that they are good, as a result of the judgment of those who say so, notice there's some ambiguity here, but they delight in being loved in itself. Hence, being loved would seem to be better than being honored. And, well, I think the distinction between being loved and being honored is a rather ambiguous one. But friendship seems to consist more in loving than being loved. True friendship consists more in loving than being loved, because you are the one performing the virtuous deed rather than passively receiving it from the other person. And happiness is bound up with activity, with action, not just undergoing experiences. He goes on, he says, since friendship consists more in loving than in being loved, and those who love their friends are praised, loving seems to be a virtue of friends. I think it turns out it is a virtue of friends. As a result, those in whom this arises in accord with merit, it's their status, like what kind of person they really are stable friends, right? He's just talking about complete friendship here, right? As is their friendship. It is in this way especially that even those who are unequal might be friends, since they could be rendered equal by a difference in the love offered on each side. Equality and likeness constitute friendly affection, and especially the likeness of those who are alike in point of virtue. And therefore they're stable because they're based on virtue. So likeness in point of virtue is the very definition of complete friendship. People who are alike in virtue, and it's therefore stable because there really is no logical reason why you would want to end that type of relationship, because it is constantly in a variety of different ways is beneficial to you and in contributing to your happiness. Then I'll just read this one line. Those who are corrupt, and of course the people with bad self-love are going to be corrupt. Those who are corrupt are without steadiness, however, for they do not remain alike even to themselves. So this is another way in which people are multiple, because they change over time. And the very idea of the virtuous person is one whose character is solidified, is stable, does not change significantly in any essential way over time. Whereas people who are corrupt, their identity is constantly fluctuating. How can you be a friend with someone like that? One day they're one thing and the next day they're the next. You're trying to love a thing, and if that thing keeps changing, there's a structural problem there. So we continue with self-love here in Book 9, Chapter 4. It says, "But the mark of friendship in relationship to those around us, and by which friendships are defined, seem to have arisen from things pertaining to oneself. For people set down as a friend someone who wishes for and does things that are or appear to be good for the other person's sake, or as someone who wishes for his friend, for the friend's own sake, to exist and to live." He says, the marks of friendship seem to have arisen from things pertaining to oneself. We wish for the other person for their own, we wish them well, that's goodwill, and we wish them things for their own sake. Well, wait a second. Self-love dictates that we wish well for ourselves and that we do things for our own sake. And who are we going to do this first and foremost with? Not other people, but with ourselves, because of the structure of human life, in the structure of our needs and desires, and the problems encountered by having distinct bodies, and so on. So this is immediately turning to a notion of self-love in the sense of friendship with oneself. And it may turn out that friendship with oneself turns out to be the highest form of friendship, and maybe something we learn in kind of pop psychology today, that one cannot truly love others until one first truly loves oneself. Because if one doesn't love oneself because of what one has done, then seeking out the attention of others is not going to be the result of love. It's actually going to be the result of some other motivation that's not as worthy, not as dignified. This is just what mothers feel toward their children, as do even those who have quarreled with their friends. Some also set down as a friend someone who goes through life together and with another, and who chooses the same things as he does, or who shares in sufferings and joys. What do we say friendship already was between two people on the most basic level? It's a bond created by a commonality of pleasures and pains. Of course, for Aristotle, for it to be a complete friendship, they have to be the right pleasures and the right pains. The pleasures for complete friendship must be virtuous activity or virtuous deeds, not just any old pleasure, right? And those are pleasures of the soul. So what are friends? People who go through life together. What happens when you go through life together? Two connected things. One, you get to know each other. But number two, you go through the same experiences. So you don't even, in a sense, you're going to know each other because you've experienced the same thing, because you already know it from your point of view, which is you go through it together and you already have a common understanding of each other because you've had a common experience. And that is what's going to lead to shared sufferings and joys. Now, again, that can mean two things. It means we meet at age 30, let's say, and we've gone through common experience. We came from a certain type of household, a certain neighborhood, a certain religion. We had a certain type of education, and we can relate to one another because we've had common sufferings and joys. But it also means that once we're living together, we're going to, as just say two people, collectively experience the same sufferings and joys, the same experiences. Now, what's the problem here? We never experience those experiences identically. Only with ourselves do we experience them identically. Who is the only person where there is an identity of experience living together in suffering and joys? That's you. And you're going to be friends with someone the more you're like them. And the only person you're most alike is yourself. Okay. It says, but each of these criteria is present in the decent person in relationship to himself. What is that? That person goes through the same sufferings and joys. And what's the catch here? This is an important little insight. The decent person is one of good character, whose personality or character does not fluctuate. Therefore, from one day to the next, they experience the same things as joys and the same things as sorrows, the same things as pleasurable and the same things as painful. The person with a corrupt soul, because they don't function on reason, they function on passion. That's Aristotle's basic argument about the person with the corrupt soul. Person with the corrupt soul is the person who is a slave to their passions. Aristotle's basic premise that a good soul, a person of good character, reason rules in their soul, and that creates a kind of consistent order in their soul. The person who's decent is therefore consistent with themselves over time, whereas the corrupt person, in which they're a slave to their passions, they're constantly fluctuating. Therefore, from point A to point B to point C, they're actually in conflict with themselves because they identify themselves with different passions, right? And that's going to be the cause of conflict and unhappiness. He says, and in the rest, insofar as they understand themselves to be decent, and it appears, just as we have said, that virtue and the serious person are the measure in each case. For this decent person is of like mind with himself, and longs for the same things with his whole soul, right? And the whole soul, because his soul is in order, because reason rules. We'll come back to this in a second when we look at the chart. Indeed, he both wishes for the good things for himself, that is, the things that appear such to him, and he does them, since it belongs to a good person to work at what is good. He does them for his own sake, since he acts for the sake of his thinking part. Now, this is a description here of a complete friendship with oneself. He does them for his own sake, and he does it on behalf of his thinking part. For Aristotle, the thinking part of the human soul is the intellect. And the intellect is the highest part of the soul, and it is also the thing, therefore, that makes us distinctly human. Therefore, to live a human fully existence, to achieve happiness, to engage in the highest form of friendship, means to engage the intellect. Notice what he says. He says the thinking part of himself, which is, in fact, what each person seems to be. Aristotle now goes so far as to identify, and we'll read a passage later on, human nature. The essence of human nature is to be found not just in the body, not just in the soul, but particularly in the highest part of the soul, the intellect. The intellect is the part of us that is most distinctly human, because it separates us. It separates us from the animals. He wishes that he himself live and be preserved. So he's wishing well. It's goodwill, not toward another person. A precondition of friendship. It's goodwill now towards himself, and especially that part of himself with which he is prudent. Well, that part of himself with which he is prudent is his intellect. Prudence is a virtue of the soul, right? So he wishes well for the highest part of him, the intellect, and we'll read that passage later on. He says, "For existence is a good to the serious person." What's the difference between the decent person and the serious person? Well, one answer is the decent person is the man or the girl, the woman of moral virtue. And the serious person, remember the serious kithara player, the serious musician who doesn't want to just play but wants to play well with their instrument? The serious person is the person who wants to use their instrument of reason the best they can possibly use it, which seems to be the person of intellectual virtue. For existence is a good to the serious person, and each wishes for the good things for himself. So we really seem to be talking about friendship with oneself, which is a form of self-love. And here we have a depiction of the good form of self-love. The person is in harmony with themselves because they're exercising the highest part of them, which is ruling their life, and their soul, which is intellect or reason. Yet no one chooses to possess every good, by becoming another, for even now the God possesses the good. Now notice the God possesses the good. To possess something is not to be in need of it. The problem with human beings is we do not possess the good. We are pursuing the good, which is what separates out human beings from gods. And we will be constantly pursuing the good until we die, right? It always seems to be something rather elusive and just out of our grasp. But rather by being whatever sort he is, and it would seem that it is the thinking part that each person is, or is most of all, and that thinking part he's going to call intellect. Such a person also wishes to go through life with himself, since he does so pleasantly. So he wants to go, the man or woman goes through life in a relationship with himself. This is self-love, and this is friendship with oneself. The memories of what he has done are delightful. His hopes for the future are good, and such things are pleasant. Now, why are his memories of the past delightful? Well, this is interesting, because this is going to illustrate, by contrast, what bad self-love is, or self-love a corrupt person. Their memories of their past are enjoyable because they are good people who have done the right things. They do not feel guilt. They do not feel shame. They do not feel regret. And therefore their memories of the past are good. Their thoughts about themselves are good because they're decent people. And they also then have positive aspirations about the future. They have something to look forward to. And of course they surround themselves with good people. Therefore, all of this, they're in harmony with themselves because they're acting in accordance, to be simple, they're acting in accordance with their human nature, which is to say with their reason or intellect. His thought is also well supplied with objects of contemplation. What? He shares pains as well as pleasures with himself above all. Huh. What did he say friends were? Friends were people who share pleasures and pains, sufferings and joys. Who are you friends? Who do you share most of the pleasures and pains? Or most absolutely? Yourself. Who are you friends with? Yourself, if you have good character. If you don't have good character, what are you going to be? Arendt is going to say, you're not a friend to yourself. You're an enemy to yourself. And that will take a little bit of explanation, but we'll see it pretty clearly. Since what is painful as well as pleasant is always the same for him and not different at different times. So remember, the person with the corrupt soul, in one moment this is good, in another moment it's bad. One moment this is bad, in another moment this is good. There's constant fluctuation because their life is and soul are guided by their passions, which fluctuate. They're just impulses that are blind. Whereas reason is the thing that can see. It is the guide. It is the pilot of the ship that sees where the ship should be going and can foresee where the ship should go. Why is he so happy? Hence, he is without regret, without guilt. He doesn't say, I wish I had done something different. And so because each of these belong to the decent person in relationship to himself, and because he stands in relation to a friend as he does to himself, for the friend is another self. Friendship seems to be a certain one of these qualities, and friends, those to whom they belong. He says, as to whether or not there is friendship in relationship to oneself, let us set this question aside for the present, though it would seem that there is friendship in this way insofar as each person is two or more, or on the basis of this point stated, and that the peak of friendship is like friendship toward oneself. Now notice one thing. He says his thoughts are well supplied with objects of contemplation. Now this raises the question of what is the ultimate intellectual virtue that is for Aristotle synonymous with happiness. The answer is, the Greek word is theoria, and it is the virtue of contemplation. It is the life of contemplation. Thinking, and what's really he's talking about philosophy, comprehending the world. This raises a basic question. How many friends do you need to be a philosopher? How many friends do you need to contemplate? It is something that can be done in a solitary way. When we turn to the Symposium, Socrates, as a philosopher, he is the kind of allegory or the personification of the life of philosophy. And what does he spend a lot of time doing? Standing by himself for hours in acts of contemplation. Doesn't need anyone else, right? It also says that, we're better off, happiness is achieved by thinking and acting together. Happiness for Aristotle might be consist of a collective contemplation of the order of things. Then he says, yet the qualities spoken of appear to belong also to the many, and even to those who are base, insofar then as they are pleasing to themselves and assume themselves to be decent, do they share in this qualities? ? So what he's saying, this appears true of the base people, that they have a relationship with themselves, they experience the same pleasures and pains, and therefore they enjoy themselves and they have no regrets. Well, the problem is the answer is going to be no, because they're driven by their passions. They change. They are not the same person, and therefore they're not in harmony with themselves. By not being in harmony with themselves, they're going to be unhappy. For these certainly do not belong to any of those who are thoroughly base or act impiously, nor do they even appear to. They scarcely belong even to base people, for they differ with themselves and desire some things, but wish for others, as do those who lack self-restraint. For instead of what seems to be good to them, those lacking self-restraint choose harmful pleasures. Notice the distinction between what they wish for on the one hand. So now we're talking about base people, and we're talking about the corrupt or bad form of self-love. On one hand, they wish for one thing, but desire another. And this is going to capture why they lack self-restraint, and also why they feel badly about themselves. What do they wish for? Their rational soul knows what they should wish for. They should wish for doing the right things, for happiness, for being a good person, for having good character, for being morally and intellectually virtuous. That's what they wish for. They wish for the very same things as the person who is actually good. The problem is what they desire is not in conformity with what they wish for. What they desire are driven by the passions of the soul rather than reason, right? And therefore, the consequence is they're divided. They lack self-restraint, which means they're going to give in to passions that they cognitively, rationally know are bad, but can't resist the satisfaction of them anyway. What's going to result? Well, number one, those pleasures could be harmful in and of themselves. But number two, there's going to be a schism between the way they like to look at themselves and between what they're actually doing and what they know of themselves. They know this is right over here, but this is what their impulses dictate they do. Therefore, they're going to feel guilt. They're going to feel regret. They're going to feel bad about themselves because they're not going to be in harmony. These two halves are not going to be in harmony with one another. What they ought to do versus what their passions dictate they're doing, right? So they're actually going to be unhappy. And the question is, where does the self-love part come in? This gets interesting. And notice they engage in harmful pleasures. Could be harmful to the body, but more likely it's harmful to the soul. Because engaging in pleasures that are not consistent with good character are going to be intrinsically harmful to your soul. So this is really crucial here. He says, and those who have done many terrible things and who hate themselves on account of their corruption even flee living and do away with themselves. Corrupt people seek to pass their days with others, but they flee themselves because when by themselves they are reminded of many odious things and anticipate others. Let's start with the second point first. when they think about their past, unlike the good person, when the good person thinks about their past, they think fondly of it because they've done the right thing. In the present, they're doing the right thing. Therefore, they anticipate in the future good things will happen. Yes? And therefore, they're in harmony with themselves. They're in harmony with their past. They're in harmony with their present, their future, and their soul's in order. The bad person, who is a slave to passion by definition, remember, the reason must rule in the soul. If you do not have reason rule in the soul, that is by definition the disharmony of the soul. When these people look back on their actions, they see, number one, bad things, but then they feel regret, guilt, and shame. And then they also see the disharmony between what they should be versus what they are. And that gives them a low sense of esteem, a low sense of worth, right? They feel bad. What is guilt? What is shame? Shame is, oh, I did this, but I really know that I should have done that. If you did something and you really just wanted it, you don't feel shame, right? But when you know that that's not really what you should do, and you succumb to your impulse anyway, you're going to feel guilt and shame, right? So in theory, right, Gyges, who is he harming when he harms other people with that ring? Is he not harming his own soul because he is now in disharmony with himself, right? And then you get into questions of, does this human being feel guilt and shame? Do they accept the rational standards of conduct spelled out by Aristotle, being a good human being, or no? Right? And you notice we haven't spent much time clarifying what exactly a good human being looks like, because that's not a simple question, but we're painting this in kind of simple black and white terms here. So they don't like themselves because they see the difference between what they should be and who they actually are. Right? They're intelligent enough to know that they're doing the wrong thing. How do they try to cope with that? That's the question with the bad person. The good person is simply content with themselves. They're enjoying themselves. And the people they have around judging them are the few people who they respect their judgment, and it's only a confirmation of what they already know. The bad person is important. Corrupt people seek to pass their days with others, but they flee themselves because when by themselves, they are reminded of many odious things and still anticipate others. They're not comfortable with themselves, therefore they are not friends with themselves, because when they are by themselves, they realize they're with an enemy. They're with someone who has not lived up to the standards of human conduct. So what do? They flee themselves. They seek other people. They seek honor and recognition from others. They seek flattery from one another. They engage in politics, the life of politics, right? So who's going to have more friends, quote unquote? The good person or the bad person? The bad person is going to appear to have a lot more friends because they're going to have all these followers who are flattering them, right? And why does it have to be flattery? Because if you really knew that other person who's corrupt, you'd see they're corrupt and you wouldn't want to be friends with them. So the flatterer is just someone, the corrupt person is presenting a beatific image, a kind of morally righteous image when it's not true. And the flatterer likewise is saying, oh yeah, you're such a great person and I really want this from you. It's a deception. And it engages both self-deception and deception, and the two go hand in hand. I'm being deceived by the other person because I'm allowing it because I'm also deceiving myself. And it's a mutual relationship of deceptions, right? You would think any good relationship is founded on the truth and knowledge of the truth rather than deception. And since they possess nothing lovable, the only thing you can love and be friends with is the lovable, the good. They feel in no way friendly toward themselves. Such people certainly do not share in either joys or sufferings with themselves. Since their soul is torn by faction, one part, on account of its corruption, feels pain when abstaining from certain things, while another part feels pleasure. One part drags them here, and the other drags them there, and is tearing them asunder. This is perhaps the most important sentence here. Their soul is in conflict with itself. They feel pain and pleasure about the wrong things. This is the image of that puppet being pulled in different directions, right? That we saw in Plato's Laws. Their reason is pulling them in the right direction or toward the right object, but their desires are pulling them toward the wrong object. What is pleasurable for reason is not pleasurable for desire, and what is painful for reason is not painful for desire. So it's all mixed up, right? And their soul is being dragged down, you might say, by their passions. And it's tearing them asunder because they lack self-restraint. They lack self-control, which is the rule of reason and the soul to dictate to the passions how they should behave, so to speak. Okay, he says, for base people teem with regret. They have overwhelming regret, which is why they don't like themselves. He says the base person, therefore, does not appear to be disposed in a friendly way even toward himself, because he possesses nothing lovable. We can only love what's lovable. If we don't have it in ourselves, we can't love ourselves. That's the premise here. If, therefore, to be thus disposed is to be extremely miserable, a person must flee corruption with the utmost effort and attempt to be decent, since in this way he would both be disposed toward himself in a friendly way and become a friend to another. So a couple things here. They can flee into the arms of other people and have a whole bunch of narcissistic, egotistical friends. Or they can flee their own corruption and change because they know what the right thing is to do, but they haven't had the wherewithal to be able to do it. They lack the self-restraint. If they flee toward what is decent, notice what happens. They're disposed in a friendly way toward themselves and are able to become friend to another. So that seems to very clearly imply that one cannot be friends with others, fully true friends, until one is friends with oneself, and being friends with oneself meaning doing the right thing in accord with the dictates of reason, and therefore the rational virtues of intellectual and moral virtue. So to conclude here, we want to wrap up with 2 points, one issue of the bad form of self-love, and then conclude with the good form. Although, frankly, the bad form is much more interesting, I have to say. Rather laugh with the sinners than die with the saints, and so on. Billy Joel. Wonderful statement, line from Shakespeare's play Othello, and the entire fulcrum of the play revolves around this statement and the implications of it. Iago, the diabolical character, who himself, his motivations and his own love, he's a diabolical person, obviously can't love someone, right? He says, I've never met a man who truly loves himself. And the person who doesn't truly love themselves is insecure. They have regrets and shame. They don't think sufficiently highly of themselves. So how do they compensate? They seek out the opinions of other people. But in doing that, they're making themselves vulnerable in an inappropriate way to the other people, because their own high opinion of themselves is no longer dependent on them, but it's dependent on how they're viewed in the eyes of others. And if those other people are not good people, then they're going to be taken advantage of. And this is exactly what Iago does to Othello. The point is, if you're a good person and you depend on the other person, well, they're a good person. But if you're a bad person, who are you going to be with? The chances of you being with a good person are complicated, right? We seek confirmation from others. We see ourselves through the eyes of others, friends, because we are not self-sufficient enough, or rather we do not love ourselves enough to be content with our own opinions of ourselves. And ultimately our own opinions are based on what we know is right and whether we've lived up to that. Now we pick up in a few passages of Hannah Arendt, and this text is listed in the readings for the week. It's just a few pages, but it's really quite powerful. playing off this theme of never met a man who truly loves himself, Arendt stresses what she calls togetherness with oneself, or living with oneself. And she stresses something that is lurking in Aristotle, but like many things, he does not spell it out to us. He doesn't give it to us clearly. And that life is a permanent relationship or friendship with oneself. And it's more or less a friendship depending on our own character and our own actions, right? Because we have reason and reflection, we can both live and reflect on our own lives. We are therefore both the actor in and the audience to or of our lives. We both act and judge our own actions. So it's our rational capacity that gives us this relationship with ourselves that other animals don't have. And this is where she goes with this. Thus, the murderer is compelled to live permanently with the murderer, and every person they see, because we project ourselves on other people, every person they see is a potential murderer. Because why? It takes one to know one. I have learned something in myself of what it's like to be a murderer. And then when I see other people, what I'm able of identifying is what I'm familiar with. The principle, it takes one to know one. So let's just read this and I'll comment on it. Together with oneself. What Socrates was driving at, and what Aristotle's theory of friendship explains more fully, is that living together with others begins with living together with oneself. So let's go back to this book. What if the essence of this book in terms of human happiness is less about friendship with others, but really starts with the establishment of a genuine friendship with oneself in the quest of attaining or pursuing happiness? Socrates' teaching meant only he who knows how to live with himself is fit to live with others. The self is the only person from whom I cannot depart. Now notice, you can get away from your kid, your wife, your husband, your parents, your friends, your teachers, your school classmates, but you're always stuck with yourself, right? So think about people. You think about the corrupt soul, people fleeing themselves. You think about use of video games or drugs or distraction or movies, whatever it is. We're fleeing ourselves because we don't want to be with some of the things everybody inevitably does. I cannot depart whom I cannot leave, with whom I am welded together. Therefore, it is much better to be in disagreement with the whole world than being one in disagreement with oneself. Well, this raises all kinds of questions of, are the rules of the society you live in consistent with the human good, with real happiness? If you're in a bad society with bad rules, you, on one hand, have to follow justice in order to get by. On another, if you're following a corrupt conception of justice, you are going to be in conflict with yourself. And the story of Socrates is a character whose society had flaws of justice, and he decided to be in conformity with what he understood to be truly good, and therefore he was content with himself, but also in conflict with society. Ethics, no less than logic, has its origin in the statement, for conscience, in its most general sense, is also based on the fact that I can be in agreement or disagreement with myself. So conscience is an awareness of what's right or wrong, and an awareness of whether one has acted in conformity or lack thereof with what's right. And that means that I do not appear to others, but also to myself. So she talks about this relationship with ourselves as because we appear to ourselves, because we're able to think about ourselves and our actions. This possibility is one of the greatest relevance to politics as we understand it. He says later, for the problem of conscience is in a purely secular context, without faith in an all-knowing and all-caring God who will pass a final judgment on life on earth. This question is indeed decisive. It is the question whether conscience can exist in a secular society and play a role in secular politics. And it is also the question of whether morality, as such, has an earthly reality. So what is it? Who's the ultimate conscience? It's God, and we can't escape God. But there's serious problems that emerge. If there's no God, does everyone feel the pangs of conscience? And therefore, does doing the right thing dictate everyone's actions? Socrates says, be as you appear to others. That is, appear to yourself as you would want to appear if seen by others. Since even when you are alone, you are not altogether alone. You yourself can and must testify to your own reality. So, I mean, you can even deceive how you appear to yourself, right? That's self-deception. So be who you really are and acknowledge that to yourself. Or to put it in a more Socratic way, for although Socrates discovered conscience, he does not yet have a name for it. The reason why you should not kill, even under conditions where nobody will see you. So this, we said, was the great question of the Republic. What is the argument to refraining from an unjust action when there is going to be no worldly consequence? What argument do you make to Gyges, who has all the power, right? And all you have to him is the power of speech to make an argument to him, because he has the power of, the military or invisibility at his disposal. Even under conditions where nobody will see you, that's the ring of Gyges right there, is that we cannot possibly want to be together with a murderer. By committing murder, you would deliver yourself to the company of a murderer as long as you live. So Aaron's, simple conclusion here is that conscience would prevent us from wanting to murder, because that means we'd have to live with a murderer, and living with a murderer would be ourselves. She says, you cannot possibly want to be together with a murderer. By committing murder, you would deliver yourself to the company of a murderer as long as you live. You would deliver yourself to the company of yourself, who is a murderer. Now, this is probably the only argument that can be made to Gyges as to why he should not transgress against people when he has the power of invisibility. And this is the argument. It's the essence of the argument of the Republic, is that it's harmful to one's soul to commit transgressions, because we see what happens to the base or the corrupted person. They're not a happy person, and everybody wants to be happy, so you shouldn't do these things. The problem is people do these things all the time. And furthermore, does their reason really dictate that they really think what they've done is wrong? Do they really feel conscience? Do they really feel guilt? The average person, most people, absolutely. That's why 99.9% of people don't kill anybody, right? I mean, it's not hard not to kill someone, right? It's very easy, in fact. It's not a desire that 99.9% of people want to exercise. They don't even have it, because the rules are so clear to them. However, there's clearly some tiny segment of humanity in which they do not feel these pangs of conscience. And I think this is no argument against Gyges or the murderer. And this is a dark question that needs to be raised, particularly as we turn to 1984. A world that is dystopian, in which no one is friends with themselves, and the people who have created this order seem to have no problem with it. And one of the aspects of this world is the mental control. So what seemed to be the natural reaction of a human being to an atrocious crime, they modify people's psychology to make it in conformity with a horrible regime, because it seems that naturally people would not want to live under oppression. Human nature. But what if a regime in 1984 had the power to change human nature and make it conform to standards of justice, standards of happiness that don't seem to be consistent or intelligible to the average human being, because they can control your mind, right? This is the problem. We said a utopia is a regime in which everyone is enemies with one another. The murderer is an enemy to themselves, right? Because they've committed something they know is wrong and they're in conflict with themselves. So let's turn lastly, very briefly, to the positive understanding of self-love and its implications in Book 10.